everyone. Glad that all of you could make it. And as you know, this is something that we've been mulling about for a while now, and we're still not sure about what format to adopt, what our audience should be, and so on. So this is a kind of like a trial run, just so that we can figure out the best way of engaging with this giraffe that made its way across the ocean, and our ways of relating to it, and indeed whether this is something that we can think about or something that we can put before the public, and if so, in what form. So today we'll just take this as it comes. We've each got a time slot, and this is going to be flexible within limits. So we each speak, sing, dance, gesticulate, get somebody else to read, or whatever it is over the 10 minutes that we have. And I just thought I'd speak for around 10 minutes and frame a question, since it might be useful to actually think about what lies behind this venture, right? Why are we doing this in the first place? Apart from the fact that we get along so well and we like the same things and we enjoy each other's company as much as poetry, etc., etc. So to begin, and when we started talking about this, the question was really that of the giraffe that made its way from Africa to China. It stopped off on various places. There's the kind of metaphysical idea of this oceanic travel of an animal. There is the idea of the movement of trade and commodities across the ocean. There is this particular instance of a regal gifting that happens. There are all these stories of voyages across the ocean by Zheng He and so on. So the question is, we can approach this issue of this travel of the giraffe and the gifting of the giraffe in multiple ways, and that's what I'd like to think about. Because as we know, I mean, this idea of animals being gifted, animals traveling across the ocean goes back to the Bible. So you have in Kings chapter of the Bible, you have King Solomon being regularly gifted every year from Ophir with apes, ivory, and peacocks, right? And this is a phrase that has actually come to signify the exotic trade that happens between the East and the West and across the ocean. And of course, there have been all kinds of debates about this as to whether it was apes, ivory, and peacocks. Does the word tukiyin mean baboons, or does it mean peacocks? It depends upon how one translates the word. And there are these multiple kind of recondite debates that are carried on by scholars, as I discovered when I was looking at the net. But the most important thing for us, I think for me in this, is this whole issue of the engagement with the question of the human and the animal, which we've increasingly begun to think about, this hard division between the human and the animal, the going back again to the Genesis, where God gives humans dominion over the earth and its animals, and how in the redefining of the period that we live in as the Anthropocene, we've had to rethink this question, rethink the question of a common fate, that regardless of whether we are humans or animals, we occupy a planet that is dying, we occupy a planet that's under siege, and that in fact, it may indeed be the hubris of humans in impacting on the environment in multiple ways, including animals. That's lies at the heart of the crisis. Now, the question is, having said that, how exactly are we to think this issue between the human and the animal? Because even when we think about the giraffe, there's a lot of anthropomorphizing that goes on. You know, the existential dilemma of the giraffe, as it were, the tragedy of a giraffe plucked from its roots. There are associations in our mind with slaves and other beings whose lives are rendered abject through the actions of humans. But if you think about the broad philosophical ways of looking at this, there does seem to be a divide between European epistemology and Asian and African epistemologies in thinking about the relation between the human and the animal. So if you're reading people like Derrida, for example, there's the idea of the absolute alterity of the animal. The animal is something different. Right? Humans possess reason, humans possess particular qualities. Even if you think about Marx, humans are seen as possessing the quality of labor, whereas we know that most of the labor is done for humans by animals, if you think about the global south. So there's absolute alterity versus the idea of continuity, that there is a kind of porosity of life between humans and animals. And this comes up in medieval ideas of the great chain of being, that there's a great chain of being all the way from the human to the lowest insect on earth. And there's a kind of affinity, a bond of affinity that connects us with the divine. So that as late as the 13th and the 14th centuries, we know that when crops were destroyed by insects, insects were summoned to church to answer for their sins. As late as the 19th century, horses and pigs could be prosecuted in court for attacks on their masters, and so on and so forth. So this idea of a kind of porosity or continuity continued to exist, right? And this is again something that's worth thinking about. And in South Asian historiography, for example, this wonderful book by Radhika Govindarajan speaks about human-animal intimacies. So she takes the sub-Himalayan region and looks at people who work with goats, sheep, cattle, relations with marauding monkeys, and how these relationships are governed by a sense of intimacy. So you rear an animal with love, like a member of the family, and then when you kill it and eat it, it's not merely an act of violence. Right? There is a whole degree of investment, of affect, and of care that goes into this. So how do we think about these kinds of issues? It brings us back to the giraffe, because when you think about the people who travel with the giraffe, right, and who maintain the giraffe on that journey, that's again a story that we could think about, where it's not really about the pride and the hubris of kings that we're thinking about. We're actually thinking about the actual relation between a giraffe and the person who tends to it, who keeps it alive. And one could see this as something that's a very strong bond, just as much as when we think about circuses, for example. One way of thinking about circuses is, of course, that, these are exploitative machines in some sense, but it's also the years of love and care that go into the training of an animal and the violence. And this is something that studies on the circus over the last 10 years have been trying to take up, this whole issue of how exactly are we to look at this whole issue of the training of the animal? Can an animal be trained without that bond of affect between the trainer and the animal? And these are all questions that we could keep in mind. The whole economy of gentleness and violence, so to speak, that goes into the relation between the human and the animal in this book at the same time. The two other questions that I want to pose, and then I'll stop, because when we think about the last conversation that we had, Tansen was talking to us about the presentation of giraffes or presentation of animals being a common royal thing. So you had animals being gifted to kings in Europe, and this is something that continues into the post-independence period. So for example, when Nehru is the prime minister, elephants are sent to Japan, pandas are sent from China to India. You have the presentation of animals between Joseph Broz Tito and Nehru as part of the non-aligned movement. In the 1970s, by 1968, there are no cheetahs left in India because of the hunting. So the Shah of Iran is approached for the gift of some cheetahs to India. Meanwhile, the Shah of Iran is deposed in the revolution and no cheetahs arrive. And it's only now in November this year that South Africa is going to gift 8 cheetahs, 5 males, 3 females to India to restart the cheetah population. So if you think about that presentation of the giraffe to the Chinese court, there's also a long history here, right? Which comes down to the present and the ongoing process of gifting that is happening. And this takes us back to a very interesting question. A long time ago in the 70s, the feminist Gail Rubin talked about the gift exchange that happened, right? Where the whole process of maintaining kinship was the process of gifting women, right, through marriage and so on. And there was a certain hierarchy that was put into place between the sexes in which women could be gifted by men in marriage to form strategic political alliances and so on. And so when we think about this whole process of gifting, it happens within a structure of power, which takes us back to the relation between the human and the animal and the perception of a hierarchy, given all the other issues that we've talked about, the affective relationships and so on and so forth. Finally, this question of the exotic animal and the edible animal, right? So we make a division in our minds between animals that are domesticated and those that are not, feral and wild animals versus domesticated, animals that humans can eat, animals that humans cannot eat. So you would eat your lamb or a goat that you rear by hand, but you would not eat your dog or cat. Right? And cultures that do so are regarded with a certain degree of opprobrium. But when you also think about situations of crisis, for example, one of the most interesting stories, the Paris Commune, right? We celebrated the Paris Commune recently. And when you think about what happened during the Paris Commune, as the Prussian army pressed on the French forces and people were getting hungry, the first animals to be eaten were, of course, the domestic animals, the horses, the goats, the sheep, even mice and rats. And then people moved into the zoo, right? And they started eating the animals in the zoo. And the two magnificent creatures, the two magnificent elephants, Castor and Pollux, named after the Gemini, the stars, they were eaten. But interestingly enough, even in the middle of eating of zebra and eating of elephants and so on, consistently they refused to eat the monkeys because the monkeys were seen as kin to humans. So while multiple distinctions were collapsing during the Paris Commune, the monkeys were absolutely safe. The only other animal which was safe was the hippo, because they charged 80,000 francs for the meat of the hippo, and the butchers said, hey, no one has that kind of money, so the hippo was saved. So I just wanted to put before you a whole set of issues of this kind as to thinking about what the relation between humans and animals might be, what this trafficking in animals or the movement of animals might be. How do we think about the animal both as object as well as an object and commodity, as well as something that is bound by deep affective bonds to the human? So I'll stop there, and maybe we can just take it up in sequence. I mean, going by, Sumi, do you want to start? And then we can go on to Alvin, and then we go on to Ari, and then we can go on to Yvonne, and then Tansen. Is that okay?
No, I think I'll come later.
That's it.
Yeah, so.
Great. So who wants to bell the giraffe?
I'm happy to go next.
Okay, great, Alvin. Let's go for it.
Partly because I was working on this thing. I was just writing up all the way up to now, so it's very drafty. But I take it that's appropriate to the circumstances. We're all just playing around with things. So its working title is The Idea of the Giraffe, and I think I'm happy to go next because it dovetails very nicely with a lot of things Dilip was talking about. So if I may proceed.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'll just read. Singapore's well-resourced National Library lists over 400 titles in its catalogue for the keyword giraffe. Of these, 33 are non-fiction titles, mostly bemoaning the impending extinction of our planet's most superlative creatures, tallest, largest, fastest, and so on, in the wake of human activity. The rest of the 400 titles overwhelmingly are children's books. Sweet Giraffe, Cute Giraffe, Lost Giraffe, Found Giraffe, Baby Giraffe. If one were to form a view of the giraffe by browsing the library's English language collection, one would come to imagine an improbable comic mythic creature, the subject of fond derision, to be beloved and wondered at and subsequently mourned, but not to be taken seriously. Now, the modern Chinese name for the giraffe is the Changjinglu, literally the long-necked deer. In olden times, it was said to be the legendary Qiling, not quite a unicorn, but a cryptozoological being nonetheless. You can still see the Kirin or Qiling as a Japanese beer brand, for example. Now, this idea of the mythical Qiling resonates with the archaic name for the giraffe in the West, the camel leopard, a name attributed to early visitors to the African continent who describe a camel-like creature with spots like a leopard and two large horns on its head. Now, it was believed that this animal, this creature, was the unnatural offspring of a male camel and a female leopard, a calisthenically improbable hybrid that still marks the giraffe in its scientific name, Giraffa camelopardalis. Sorry, pardon my Latin. This miscegenation of species has been described as having an ideological implication. And the way it goes is this, right? It was implied by European scholars for 1,000 years that it was the uncouth behavior of these two very different species that had led to the formation of this giraffe, this creature. And this was a theory which suited them for a really long time because it apparently removed responsibility from the Christian God for having created this creature. It was deemed so improbable, so weird, so far out, so wrong somehow that it must have been the product of some sort of hanky-panky not condoned by the divine. This odd belief in the giraffe's origin is reiterated by the Sicilian Timaeus, who wrote in 260 BC, "The giraffe is the most wonderful, both for the beauty of its form and the extraordinary manner of its production. For they say that the giraffe proceeds from a female Ethiopian camel, a wild cow, and a male hyena. For in Ethiopia, the male hyena, pairing with a female camel, she gives birth to a young one partaking of the natures of both parents. And if this happens to be a male and to pair in turn with a wild cow, the result of the second cross is the giraffe or the camel leopard." Now, in the early 1200s, Zhao Rugua, a customs inspector in the Chinese city of Quanzhou, is said to have recorded a second-hand description of a beast described as having a leopard's hide, a cow's hoofs, a 10-foot tall body, and a 9-foot neck towering above that. He called it, in the records, a zula, possibly a corruption of zarafa, or fast walker, which is the Arabic word for giraffe, which apparently is also how we get the modern English name giraffe, from the Arabic by way of several European tongues and eventually to the English. In 1613, the giraffe is said to have given its name to a constellation, Camelopardis, and the name has remained to this day. So apparently in the stars, there is a constellation named for the giraffe. I didn't know this until I started doing some homework on it. And now I'm very curious to see this constellation. Now, all these threads, all these flows serves to remind us that our ideas about this particular fellow mammal, as of so many other matters, and indeed of the very names we hold in our mouths, have been formed and filtered by centuries of traffic in language and goods over land and sea. The giraffe, whatever its biological truths and evolved practicalities, is, as we have received it, a tall tale and a mashed up one. And it is the idea of the giraffe, its meanings, that we have harnessed and put to use. Edmund Blair Bowles, in his book, A Second Way of Knowing, The Riddle of Human Perception, writes that many who see giraffes for the first time in the African grasslands register only one animal where there are several. Giraffes are so unusual, he claims, they seem to overwhelm the senses. The brain does not know what to do with its input. So we sort of collapse multiple individuals into archetypes. This overwhelming spectacle of the giraffe has, of course, also been famously employed to stage light the fiction of power, which is also as often about sitting out above the crowd to take in what few might reach. Julius Caesar was recorded to have brought the giraffe to Rome to be torn to shreds by lions in his arena, after which the giraffe recurs in Roman menageries and depictions. Emperor Commodus in the 2nd century AD is apparently the first documented person to have killed a giraffe with his own hands. Lorenzo of the Medicis in 15th century Florence, as a show of power and a tool for advancement, procured a giraffe through a prospective Egyptian ally and brought it to Florence as part of a winning strategy of political self-aggrandizement. It was allowed to roam Florence, apparently, if you can imagine that, until one day it broke its neck on its own specially built stable. Records often show a lack of finesse, shall we say, to do with caring for these imported beasts, how to handle them, what to expect. The point really was more about showing them off. An important breakthrough in the traffic of giraffes seems to have been the successful rearing of baby giraffes on cow's milk in the late 13th century, which meant that they could be more easily bred in captivity and transported, and therefore bought and sold. By the time Chinese Admiral Zheng He's late 14th century expedition, itself, of course, a tour de force in every sense of the word, famously acquired its pair of giraffes in Bengal, courtesy of Malindi in what is now modern Kenya. An ecosystem had therefore already been put in place, had grown up for establishing the giraffe as a rare but valuable object, a gift of high diplomatic import, a signifier of political, economic, diplomatic, and logistical prowess, and as an internationally tradable live good. My point, of course, is all these things had to come into play before we can get to the story of Zheng He's giraffes and its transport, its gift to the emperor. The whole system had to be put in place. In The Cultural Giraffe, the closing chapter of his 2010 book, Giraffe, Edgar Williams argues that the giraffe has become a symbol of the modern world, ubiquitous in commerce and culture, and given a celebrity status that has helped, ironically, secure its survival as a species. But he also reminds us that the more modern giraffine image symbolizes many things. To some, it symbolizes Africa. To others, the fragility of species and the importance of biodiversity. To yet others, it is a symbol of grounded vision, intuition, flexibility, and far-sightedness. It is true that its exotic beauty, graceful shape, quiet and passive attitude, its elusive manner and long eyelashes give the giraffe a feminine quality. Even the Victorian giraffe hunters hinted at its femininity. The most beautiful point about the giraffe is the eye, which is large, dark, full, and of the most melting tenderness and shaded by long lashes. This sentimentality fits with the ethos and code of hunting at the time. It was a masculine pursuit to tame and dominate Mother Nature, red in tooth and claw. Animals were seen as either domesticated or wild, violent or peaceful. There was no conflict in the Victorian mind between being a hunter and a conservationist. They were the same thing, the act of preservation and mounting of species, whether as a museum exhibit or mounted trophy heads or skins. All this was considered conservation. It was also around Victorian times that giraffes became a staple zoo exhibit, increasingly around the world. Today, the number of captive giraffes in the world zoos is said to number some 1,300, might be more by now. Although, of course, many modern zoos have also worked to conserve the living species in somewhat less morbid ways. The Singapore Zoo, which is laid out like a wildlife nature reserve, saw the birth of its first giraffe calf in almost 30 years in 2015. And it was named Jubilee because 2015 was Singapore's Jubilee year of independence. Fed a diet of Australian hay and Southeast Asian fruit, this celebrated young creature, the offspring of parents from Israel and the Netherlands, thrives in a city almost as hybrid and storied and confluent as its own species. And in a city just as often misunderstood and looked past, celebrated not for its own unique sake, but for what riches, reward, and repute it might offer to the latter-day global adventurer. A coda, and I'll finish here. My own first glimpse of a giraffe in the wild was during a school field trip to the Masai Mara in Kenya, years and years ago. And I snapped a picture of a large male positioned magnificently and photogenically against Mount Kilimanjaro as we drove by. And it was only later, upon closer examination of my developed prints, did I realize why it was standing so very still. It wasn't striking a pose, it was taking a piss.
Thanks, Alvin.
That's all. That's all I have.
That's a wonderful note on which to end your talk. I don't know whether you're taking the piss here but I think the interesting thing that you pointed out is when you, at the very beginning, I mean, this is a wonderful trawling that you did through the library where the giraffe is poised between extinction and sentimentality, right? That it might vanish forever, but at the same time, it's present in children's books as this object of love and so on. And I mean, giraffes, as you know, are mute animals. So then that brings up Gayatri Spivak, can the giraffe speak? And if so, who speaks for the giraffe? And that's what we're doing right now. And perhaps you could have the next one. And Ari, again, I look to you for advice. I mean, should we have questions or shall we have a discussion at the end after everybody's done? Ari? Yvonne?
I'd say at the end. I'd say the end.
Okay, great. Okay.
In the end. Yeah.
So Yvonne, would you like to go next?
Okay. So I've got a PowerPoint to support my conversation. Rhoda, how do I do that?
You can share your screen.
Share screen.
Yeah.
And then how do I find
share screen at the bottom?
It will prompt you about which of your windows to share.
Oh, okay. So I have to have it on, right?
Have it open, yeah.
Okay, just a second. Let me do that.
It's a choice between seeing you or your slide, and
the slide is part of the performance, and then I'll be reading. Oh, where are you?
Bottom, right at the bottom, share screen. Move your cursor all the way down.
Okay, just a second. Let's try that again. Okay, you said move my cursor all the
way to the bottom, and you have mute, stop video.
There we are. Okay, got it. I got it. Okay, there we are. Okay. Is it there? It's there?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay, wonderful. Right, I'll read the rest. So this just forms a backdrop. Intertextuality. Okay, how to move a giraffe from point A to point X. It seems our session was also anticipated by the BBC this morning. Because of their height, giraffes have got scarily high blood pressures, yet do not have hypertensive problems. And the answer to that question seems to be, and I quote, pressurized organs, altered heart rhythms, blood storage, and the biological equivalent of support stockings, end quote. My own answer would have been because they're giraffes, and we are not. But that is, I guess, why no science lab has sought me out. But it doesn't stop me from applying anyway. Anyway, for our session, I ended up getting a little bit obsessed about the mechanics of moving these tall ungulates. And it is your fault, frankly, if I'm next seen chasing after hapless giraffes. This whole exploration became a bit of a rabbit hole that became a little hard to escape from. But all sorts of speculative questions have emerged in the process, and quite fortunately, no answers. Mostly, I end up looking at the praxis, the practicalities behind the methodology of Giraffe and Wrangler. And Dilip, it seems the same giraffe muse may have visited us, because you're going to find resonances in what some of the questions you posed. So the methodology of Giraffe and Wrangler and the whole space of translocation from wilderness to Malindi, to a ship, to Bengal, and then on to China. I'm curious about the cartography of these particular movements, the imagined visuals and emotions, the effect of this historical 15th century translocation. I was also curious about the in-between places of relationship, memory, and encounter in and through the geographies that such a translocation entailed. And I'm treating the mechanics of the process as a scaffolding upon which these are built. My motivation is, of course, curiosity and fictive witness. The comparative examples that I use in this are all very contemporary. But the rules of moving giraffe from point A to X remain, it seems, fundamentally the same. And now for the giraffe itself. I told you I slipped down a rabbit hole. The giraffe is an African artiodactyl mammal, meaning that it has hooves. Tallest living terrestrial animal, the largest ruminant. That's from Wikipedia. There are 9 species, 9 extant species, which of course leads to the question, which one made it to the Forbidden City? They live in herds of related females and their offspring, or bachelor herds of unrelated males that also live through hierarchies, which means they're gregarious and seek company, the lack of which can make them deploy, which is something that I think is their greatest superpower, the will to die. They will themselves to death, suggesting that it made you wonder. They must have, for the giraffes to survive the journey, it's very likely then that they must have transported more than one. I think Alvin touched a little bit on the etymology, and I was going to do that here. But let me throw in the Swahili word twiga. I tried to figure out where that came from. Just because of time constraints, I couldn't. Well, depicted in rock art throughout the African continent, the giraffe has its own hieroglyph. I was curious about the language and grammar of the transaction. How was that information? We need a giraffe or two. How was it communicated? Anyway, as Alvin also pointed out, in myth, they also have made it to the stars. Among the Swana, they read the constellation Crux as 2 giraffes. And of course, Alvin referred to Camelo Pardalis, named for them. Now, it's a little bit more. To move a giraffe, it's a feat in itself. Listen to some of you can look at that, but I'm speaking on top of that. They're designed to walk tall. Their heads can be up, their necks can be up to, they can be 7 meters. Their heads can be 7 meters above the ground. They can only sit or sleep for 40 minutes at a time. Their heads must be kept above their stomachs at all times, or they'll choke to death. They should not be too heavily sedated. Of course, as BBC highlighted this morning, they have the highest blood pressure among all mammals. They are easily shocked and can will themselves to death. Now, the African nature custodian in me got infuriated to learn in a throwaway line in the journal that the giraffes have the highest mortality rate in Euro-American zoos. But that also means, up to this day, but that also means that there is an illegal and probably an illicit corridor of trafficking and replenishment that has been established. And if I were doing a wildlife detective story, that's exactly where I'd look. Even because it is illicit, I'm curious, how do you transport something so dramatic, so huge, and do so without it attracting attention? Anyway, here's a recent example. Egregious because the prime movers, they were later restored after complaints by many of us. The prime movers were erased in a photograph when a couple of the type we're all familiar with parachuted themselves in and positioned themselves as the engineers. And then they immediately started promoting a hastily set up Save the Giraffes organization. The giraffes had to be moved because the lake in which they are, the island they had been, that in the backdrop is their island in which they had been located is shrinking because the lake around it, the Baringo, and in the Rift Valley has been rising and rising for the last year, and nobody knows why. But the images give you a sense of what it takes and what it would have taken. There's no way the giraffes would have traveled on the ships, as I said, without a wrangler as well. And they would have had to sedate them somehow. But what would they have used? And remember, their heads have to be kept above their stomachs, otherwise they will die. How did they know this? And how do they? How many? Do you wonder if perhaps many other giraffes had to die before they finally got it right? Anyway, can you imagine the conversation and commentaries on a 15th century ship? Now, back to the how-tos of this speculation. Google, of course, provided at least 60 different references. And I'm curious by how popular the topic, how to move a giraffe is. And it made me wonder if the diligent chroniclers associated with Admiral's voyages might not have a record somewhere, the details of the, the mechanics of this process. And I was also, I certainly thought it would be interesting to have a kind of 1,000-year-old timeline of the how-tos, throughout the centuries and throughout the different cultures. How has it been done up to this particular point? And seeing that anyway, more of these, so there's the movement. Now, seeing that they had roped the giraffe in this particular image, Quest of Ours, I'm going to go on a limb and speculate that given the placidity of the creature depicted, the giraffe might have been taken from its herd and hand and human raised. There are templates and precedents. There's an abundant giraffe called Dusi at the Meru National Park in Kenya, who is so strongly human identified. She looks down on her giraffe, on the giraffes. She had been abandoned, and was raised around the office of the Meru National Park. And she can be led as a horse. In history, the old Egyptians did keep giraffes as pets, and that's how they, and offloaded some to the Romans. That's how they show up in Roman literature. And the next image sequence, of course, is of another baby giraffe, Kiko. She was rescued as a baby in the northern part of Kenya, and then translocated translocated, as you can see, that keeping of the neck. I'm thinking of you spoke, Dilip, about the relationship between the wrangler and the giraffe. It would have to be something like this to sustain the neck. And as you can see, even though Kiko's a baby, it took quite a few people to transport her, and with constant attention to the neck. And this is now Kiko, a bit grown up now, and she kind of walked straight into the truck that was moving her into a new destination. That's how she was transported to her new destination. There's a whole convoy. There's a convoy behind and ahead of her, and above that there was a helicopter also kind of surveying the road ahead. And of course, and then traffic also, very interestingly enough, also moved aside as she moved on to it. So, okay, I kind of jumped a little bit, but now, before I scrambled out of the giraffe labyrinth, I became also a little curious about myth, memory, and other archives of this particularly 15th century event. An influx of Western barbarians had burnt down the assorted archives, such as those at Witu, but clues lurk in the poetic archives of the Swahili seas that might still exist. I thought I might find something quickly around, the archetype and the metaphor and the myth, and glancing at some of the key attributes of a Chilean. Just for comparison, I noted that the ideal Chilean archetype was white, and there have been occurrences of what they call leucism. Now, why do I know that in giraffes, particularly recently? Maybe it's a sign of the apocalypse. Nevertheless, there were 3 in northern Kenya. 2 were meaninglessly killed. Nobody knows why, the females. And he is the only guy left. And he's under 24-hour surveillance and is fitted with a tracking device and monitored both by satellite and computers on the ground. Now, finally, so many possibilities, mostly of history and interspecies encounters and relationships. But if I were really to write a story, it would be that of 2 exiles, the giraffe and the wrangler on a ship into the unknown. And I would design it around the scaffolding of the mechanics of transplantation and translocation. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. There we are.
Alvin took the piss and you told us a moving story. How do you move a giraffe?
Yes, a moving story.
Yeah, and I think there was an interesting, my brain was connected to 2 things. There was the visual regime, right? I mean, when Alvin was talking about the how a giraffe looks was related to how it originated, So
Yeah.
it was the horny and athletic leopard clambering onto a camel, or it was an even hornier and even more athletic hyena climbing onto a camel, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering, when you ended with the image of the albino giraffe, I mean, there's this thing, what if the first giraffe that had been spotted had been an albino giraffe?
Exactly.
And then what would our descriptions have been? Would our flights of fancy have just gone wild? Would it have been an angel and a camel? The angels are known to be notoriously celibate and sexless. And as Alvin is pointing out, the black swan, right? No one knew about black swans until they were found by Taleb, by Nassim Taleb in his book, or rather, it was found in Australia. Anyway, so now let's get on to Tansen, and then maybe we can have Ari and end with Sumangala, as Sumangala desired. In good Indian tradition, to speak last is considered a sign of honor and worthiness. So Sumangala last. So over to you, Tansen.
Okay, I'll also do a PowerPoint. This is based on the research I had done on the elephants and giraffes. I don't know if I circulated the article last time or not, but I can do that again. But let me see. This relates to some of the things that I think has been said already, and I think Dilip was pointing out about the Nehru's elephants. I actually started working on this elephant that was presented to China by Nehru. It's called Asha, and I'm still working on this elephant. There are lots of archival sources about this elephant. I actually wrote in my article on the one that went to Netherlands. And my question was how, actually, Yvonne's point, how do you actually transport large animals from one place to another? So she showed some pictures. These are also available on the internet. How do you actually put a giraffe on a ship? This would be pre-steamship giraffe. And there are some interesting pictures as well. This is of course not true. It seems they would they will have a hole on the deck so that the giraffe goes underneath to the bottom of the ship. That's how they would usually transport. But there are many kinds of imagination that existed about how giraffes were transported. So those who did not know imagined how giraffe may have been transported in the 15th century. But what struck me most as I was doing research on animals is Levi Strauss's idea about animals, thinking through animals. And I think that was the major point I was writing. How do you actually transport an animal from an animal perspective? And what is the agency of animal in the transportation? Not as humans want them, but the animals force human to make changes to the ships in order for them to be transported from one place to another. And a lot has been done, and Alvin pointed this out, especially in the case of giraffes, how they make an impression on the onlookers. So going back to Dilip's point about human-animal entanglements, it's also the visual aspect of it, which I think is quite important. The mark that exotic animals leave on people who see them. And this is again something I wrote in my article as well. But thinking with animals, there are lots of writings on that, and I would recommend this book, Daston's book on how animals can be thought about from the animal perspective rather than from the human perspective. And so the human animal entanglement doesn't have to be from a human perspective. It can be from an animal perspective as well. And so what I was doing in my article, and I'm still continuing to do with regard to the elephant that was sent to China in the 50s, is can we think about all this transportation and connectivities from an animal perspective, and the animal mobility perspective. And within the animal, there's a hierarchy. It goes from, let's say, giraffe to rodents and insects that also moved on ships. So there's a way in which they become part of the ships as they move, and it depends on what kind of animal we are talking about. And the connectivity part, because I do Indian Ocean, what giraffe and other animals do is it connects the hinterland to the port cities, to the watery world of the Indian Ocean, and then again to the hinterland. And then the other aspect is the circulation part, which Prasenjit Dwara has talked about. There's a lot of knowledge circulation that goes on as animal moves. How do you take care of animals? What do you feed? How do you store them? And there's a movement of others along with the animals, the skilled workers. How do you then draw the animals? And so there's a lot of very interesting side aspects to the movement that circulates. So if you look at the giraffe that was shown, and I'll show it again, it is a similar theme, somebody drawing, moving the giraffe. And you see that across the world in the 15th century. Then there's the issue of value and emotions that are attached to the movement of animals. And then we tend to forget it's not just making diplomatic encounters or perhaps making profit. There's a lot of emotion that is attached as well that comes across when the onlookers look at the elephant or the giraffe, and suddenly the giraffe dies. And there are lots of writings about that with the death of this exotic animals. And so I was looking at that. So the volume for which I wrote this article was about cargo. And so I was looking at how exotic animals as cargo have an implication on connectivity and transportation. So that's what I was looking at. And so yes, I was looking at various methods of transportation. What were the different kinds of boats and ships that were used? And this is, of course, the pre-modern, pre-steamship ways. And there are many different boats. So we find, and transportation of elephant was nothing new. It took place during the time of Hannibal. And so we can see from the pre-common era that elephants were transported over long distances. So we have South Asian ships, we have Arab boats, we have early Islamic, there were Southeast Asian, and of course, the Chinese junks come much, much later. These are 15th century huge ships, but before that, large animals, especially elephants, were transported long distances from India all the way to Rome. And so this is something that you can find that by the time we reach 15th century, there's already the technology and know-how about how to transport large animals. So it's nothing new that a giraffe would be transported in the 15th century from Eastern Africa to other parts of the world. So that know-how, and this is part of the circulation of knowledge. So those who were involved in shipbuilding knew how to transport large animals. So they won't be surprised transporting giraffes in the 15th century. But the issue was putting them on board, and this is the I think the attachment, emotional and thinking with the animal part. It entails a lot of suffering, even with the steamships. How do you lift an elephant, put it on board? This is camel being transported from India to Australia, and so that kind of I call it the resistance from the animals. As they are transported, I think is a very important part of thinking with animals. They don't want to be on the ships. This is not their natural habitat. And then how do we look at that perspective, right? It's good for us humans looking at giraffes in Singapore, but they don't want to be in Singapore, right? So how do you bring them there, right? I mean, and this pain that goes through is quite important. And on the ships, I think there is this, again, human-animal entanglement that takes place. Mortality rate is pretty high. Transporting horses, for example, I think the most important commodity, animal commodity, about 30 to 50% of horses would die as they were transported from the Persian Gulf to India and beyond. But there are also images about how, and this is an image about how an elephant is stored on ship. It's on the deck. You can't put it anywhere else. But Then there's a very interesting photograph from the elephant that was presented by Nehru to Japan that Dilip was mentioning. He just, no, her name was Indira, after Nehru's daughter. She just refused to come down. So it's not just putting the animals on board, but taking them out was a huge issue as well. So these kinds of what happened when the animals were actually on the ships is also, I think, quite fascinating aspect of animal transportation. It was not quite easy. And then this is, I think, one of the best books on giraffes in the 15th century, and especially about giraffes coming to China. And the point about them breaking necks is quite important. I think this is something that was, again, known by people who were transporting the animals, that you have to store the giraffe in such a way that their necks don't break, right? So this is, again, part of the knowledge circulation that took place. And this is quite common, and we see it at a number of, and this Medici's Giraffe is another very interesting book about the circulation of giraffe in the 15th century. But yes, again, knowing that you have to store the giraffe in a certain way was known to the people who were transporting the giraffe in the 15th century. That's the book. So what I was looking at in my article or my presentation as well is giraffes going in different directions. Medici's giraffe happening almost at the same time as the giraffes are going to China. And so 15th century, I call it the age of giraffes. It ends actually with the 15th century. 16th century, 17th century is the age of elephants. So in the 17th century in particular, the elephants going from India to Portugal, and there are a number of such, including this one, if you can see. And there are elephants moving around later on. But giraffes in the 15th century go to different places and different regions. So I would not call them Changhe's giraffe, for example. That's just one-off thing. And giraffes are going to different places. This is going to Timur-Lane in the 15th century, quite an important one. We find this in Cuttack in Orissa, although there are no written records about giraffe in Orissa from this period, but it's also in the 15th century. It appears in the temple in Cuttack. And of course, if you map the giraffes, we see them in the 15th century showing up in different places around the Afro-Eurasian world. And so there are giraffes in Eastern India, giraffes in Central Asia, giraffe in China, giraffes in Cairo, Egypt, and going to Florence. So this is a widespread 15th century phenomena within which the one that went to China can be placed, right? So it's not just going in one direction, it's going in different directions. So what I found, the key role of this circulation of giraffe is actually done by the Mamluks in Egypt. And so they create this mechanism in the 15th century in which animals from different parts of Eurasian world circulate. They have veterinarians, they have hospitals for the elephants, for the giraffes. So anything happen, they know where to take them. So this becomes the hub, if you want to call that, the circulation of animals, including giraffes. So giraffes would come on the Nile all the way up to the Mamluk territory and then circulate from there, going either across the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean. So the Mamluks are the key players in the circulation of the giraffes in the 15th century. And it's very important to look at what they are doing to facilitate that. And it's not just giraffe moving around, there are leopards and other things that's going in the 15th century. For the Ming in particular, and this I would emphasize this, there were 7 giraffes between 1414 and 1438. I've listed 5 here. And the 2 ones, the first one from Bengal and then the last one also from Bengal, I argued that they are for different reasons. We see what's happening in 1414 in Bengal is very different from what's happening in Bengal in 1438. So the purpose of gifting giraffes is not the same. And how they appear is also very important. So you see here, Malindi is just one. of these many giraffes. So out of 7 that appeared, just 1 that actually comes from Malindi, and that could be part of what Zheng He brought in. The others had nothing to do with Zheng He's ships. They were brought separately, it seems. They ended up in China, but they came from different parts. And I would suspect the Mamluks, through their Arab handlers, were moving this giraffes or across the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean world. Also quite interesting for me was the reaction. What happened when the giraffes appeared, right? So, and this is in the Chinese sources, where there are various kinds of court officials and artists linking up the appearance of giraffes to the legitimacy of this Chinese emperor who had usurped the throne, and saying that, look, this indicates that you are the emperor of the world. And so this showing up of this exotic animal shows that you are the legitimate emperor. So this is the kind of poems and the writings that appeared. And what you see, a similar thing is happening in Florence, to show that appearance of giraffes has something to do with the legitimacy of the ruler, the Medici there, and so forth. But what I was struck with is the reaction of the emperor in China. He said, I don't want to do anything with these giraffes. They are exotic animals. I'm not interested. And how to explain that? I mean, he could use that to legitimize himself, but he says, I don't want anything to do with it. And that was something that I was trying to really figure out. Why would the emperor react in such a way when others are telling him, this is your power, this is your legitimizing yourself. But it may have to do with the Confucian value of rejecting anything foreign. This happens when the British arrive in the Qing dynasty later on. The emperor says, I don't want anything foreign, I have everything with me. So this seems to be a Confucian way of saying that, I have everything I need, I don't need any foreign things. But that kind of a reaction is also something I was looking at in the 15th century. And of course, these kinds of paintings, which are very, very common across, I showed you from the Timur, here it's China, and it always comes with the handlers. Who are these people, right? And these are, of course, foreigners, but we can trace them also in the 15th century. These people were also circulating with the giraffes. And so I would say the agency of animals is not just changing the structure of ships, but also facilitating the movement of technical people with expertise in different things, taking care of animals, right? So I would say giraffes moving is not just giraffes moving, it's a whole set of things moving with the giraffes, which I think I would call an ecosystem of the giraffes, which includes these people. So I would say in the giraffes connectivity, it's doing many different things. It's connecting different places. It's connecting Africa, Asia, Europe. It's basically circulating various kinds of knowledge, linking up different imperial courts. It's also helping the shipping communities make money. Of course, the profit is there as well. But it's also spread of geographical knowledge. I think 15th century marks a very important stage about knowledge of geography. Portuguese come in soon after the Zheng He voyages. And this connection between the Zheng He voyages and the Portuguese, because they come exactly where the Zheng He voyages go, Malindi, Cochin, Malacca in Southeast Asia, and the Portuguese come in the same ways in the opposite direction. So there is a geographical knowledge that is going on in the 15th century that we can perhaps connect to the colonial era Europeans coming in. And what role did the giraffes play in that circulation of geographical knowledge? This is something Dilip has to come up with as part of this project. And perhaps that's what we will end up about how knowledge spreads with giraffes. I will end with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tansen. That was an amazing spread of information with lots of references and so on. And I think this idea that we tend to take this transportation of the giraffe to Yongle's court as being unique, but you've actually shown how there's a prior history of movement of heavy animals and the giraffe fitting into that. But one thing that actually struck me as very interesting, which connects up with the previous paper as well, is that when you say, let us think with the animal, and you mentioned the new work that's coming out on anthropomorphism, thinking with the animal. Yvonne had mentioned the placidity of the giraffe. You mentioned the petulance of an elephant, right?
Yeah.
And there is a circulation that is happening here of notions of essential characteristics, which are granted by the human to the object that they desire. And you find a similar discourse operating around the slave trade as well, where some are seen as amenable to transport, some are seen as fighting against, some are seen as recalcitrant, intransigent, and so on. So it'd be interesting to kind of connect up this movement of bodies, both human and animal, and the perception of these bodies by those who are transporting them. The perception of placidity, good, petulance, bad. So it's a very interesting dimension that actually connects up with the slave trade, which is happening at around the same time. The age of discovery leads to what's called the age of discovery, leads to the movement of animals on a large scale as well as bodies. And it's that twin tragedy that actually is also at the heart of this. Thank you so much. And now we'll go on to Ari.
Well, it's not Ari, is the sheik and in charge of these proceedings. Tabo is the giraffe keeper, and the assistant is Purav. So imagine a dhow from Malindi, the giraffe keeper and his assistant with his parchment and ink by the cage on the deck. On stage, you can only see the legs and bottom part of the giraffe's torso. Again, imagined. I didn't know about the whole. Now I know about the whole. There is a mast with steps that allow people to climb up and reach their invisible necks and heads. Please go on.
Unmute, Sabu.
Mute.
Pardon-moi, s'il vous plaît. Hey, take this down. A giraffe has 4 legs.
Everyone knows that a giraffe has 4 legs.
Don't be clever with me. Write it down. What if the giraffes die? What if we get hungry and eat them? There has to be a description.
But I've drawn them. Look, each one has 4 legs. See?
You call this a drawing? Don't make me cross. Go fetch more bags. Can't you see they look hungry? I will feed you to them.
You said they don't eat people.
Go!
Why don't you let me bring 10 bags for each thing in the morning? They can eat it slowly. 10 each. Why do I have to go up and down all the time?
I'm in charge, and you have been hired for me, and let me tell you, you cook rubbish. You make me my bed crap. You never listen. I have a good mind of feeding you to the shark.
You kick me because they kick you. You're a slave. I'm a free man. I'm on hire.
Go fetch food. And I hope the storewala pins you down and gives you a good pumping.
What do you know about pumping you, eunuch beast?
Go fetch. He will poison me one day to grab my job. Do you have to vomit all the time? Shitting a mess is not enough. This is a wretched job. It doesn't help that I have to deal with an upland idiot.
I've brought the food. I've brought the food. I've watered them.
Have you sang them a song?
Next thing, I'll be writing poems for them too.
Wait until we reach the darkest night, where the night's egg is cracked open, where our life began, love and chaos. Then I will chuck you over, so the monsters that got stuck can deal with you.
There is no egg of the night.
There is, if I say so. You talk too much. Words remain at the gate of paradise. Only music enemies. Play the clarinet for them. It suits them. They stop stamping and kicking. Play, I say.
He plays.
Sorry, am I next? Oh, yes. Good. Now make my bed.
Scene
Why
two.
do the Mahabharya refuse to talk to us?
The Al-Habaria, you mean? That's what we call them in our language.
We should call them what they call themselves in their language.
My mother would have called them Merike Boyochi.
You are a Habshe.
Ah,
Whatever. They were working on the sail the whole day. The singer was at it with its oud. They all know I play the clarinet. So, well, but they refuse to speak to me.
it's because you're vermin. You're not one of them. You're not used to the sway of the ship. You're a dung cleaner.
Are you used to this way?
No, but I lied, and the sheik trusts me.
He must be daft.
I used to handle his horses, then his prize oxen, then his prized giraffes. I raised them since babies on a leash.
Well, they're not babies. How can you hold them on a leash?
We will get to 20 people. We will get 20 people for each one when we land in Bengal.
Am I the only one who eats alone this gruel by the beasts?
Yes, I eat with the cook, the Kamal handler, the storeman and the singer. I'm special.
You are not special. You sleep in sackcloth on the deck.
Watch your tongue, young man.
The sheik arrives on deck. The men stand in attention. He checks them out and climbs the ladder to look at the giraffes. He climbs down, looks at them. I saw a tear in the giraffe's eye. Are you beating her?
Never, Your Honor. Never.
Is there anything you need?
The sackcloth they gave me is no good for a bed or a blanket.
Is that how you repay my kindness, you wretched man, with complaints and moans? He leaves.
Some people sleep in silk in the hold. Some people sleep by the beast's manure.
You at least have a sack. I'm like a snail without a shell here. I will freeze when the weather strikes.
No, the weather will not strike. It will get hotter and hotter, dry as we reach Yemen.
But the nights are getting cooler. And the gruel is for animals. I keep on vomiting it into the wave. I'm seasick. I also feed the fish.
Don't let the rhythm of the sea rock you. We will get new food in Eden when we drop these guys.
Those on the small dhow over there?
Yes, they are precious. Divers from the highlands, very special slaves. Their lungs are wider. Sorry, their lungs. Ari, help me.
Are wider.
Yeah. Yes, their lungs are wider than. Their lungs are wider. They can stay under the water long and collect pearls.
What is a pearl?
It's a special food to feed their armies of mosquitoes. They have mosquitoes the size of my fist, with stingers like long knives. They eat pearls, and you must watch it. The Arab lands are full of them.
You lie.
I never lie.
You just said you lied about.
Feed the beasts and sing to the mess hall. And did you write the 4 legs? The thing I told you?
Okay, let's go through the third scene, and then we stop there.
Go through the third scene, yes.
Yeah.
The Sheikh said, we must cleanse ourselves. We are collecting his nephews from Cheetah, all clean and holy from Mecca.
How do we cleanse ourselves? I've already cleaned the beast's manure.
You have to cleanse your soul. You pagan soul of haram, you haram thing, beast you.
You think you're better because you're a Christian?
I'm better because I share my meals with a kalam handler.
Are the Al-Habaria running from me because I'm haram?
You can start by emptying all the swear words you learned at the harbor. Empty them out from the inside of your soul.
How?
Shout them over the prow, out into the sea. Do it now.
Makende, Boro,
More,
Pasha, Fumawene,
more,
Kinuka Mkundu, Kinucha Uchi, Kinuka
more.
Kumandizi.
I don't know how you had so much filth in you.
That hurt.
I'll tell the Hardanis there, and they will tie you up in sturdy coir and dip you in the big shark's gullet. Go do something useful.
You are so mean.
Go sing for the Giraffes one of your sad songs, so they forget their pain.
Okay, we can stop there. It goes on in a cruel relationship between the two until it gets inverted because the giraffes damage themselves and kick each other. Then the assistant becomes the giraffe keeper, and the giraffe keeper becomes the assistant. And it's an attempt to show kind of an intimate cruelty below, but a total, as you were saying, Dilip, of the one person devotion to the giraffes and that intimacy between them, whereas the assistant is a bit at sea literally because it's just been loaded there. And it's an attempt to say from below what happens from above, in pomp and ceremony, because as we heard from Tansen, that these were either gifts or for commercial interest or for pomp and circumstance, but the real people, those people who accompanied them anywhere and everywhere, need their stories being told somehow. I wish we did this funny thing after we've listened to these presentations. So there's a lot of corrections that are necessary. But anyway, it's an attempt to just do a bit of a kind of a cruel clown show underneath the main narrative.
I thought this was excellent because it is, again, it's interesting how our papers segue into one another, even though they were written quite independently of each other, because Tansen spoke about a whole political economy of labor that was emerging, the emergence of particular groups like probably giraffe handlers. You could describe yourself as a giraffe handler, which is a very precise kind of occupation. And here you've talked about two people who, and the tensions, the constant bickering between them, the tension of relating to each other, handling an animal, which is really not what they want to be doing on the high seas. So it's a very interesting dimension. But I think one of the interesting things here is we still have to find the voice of the giraffe, in some sense. And we've been speaking around the giraffe. And before I decided that I would just compare this meeting, kind of mediate the meeting, I was thinking of writing a set of 5 poems from the giraffe's point of view, rather like, you have Rilke's poem on the panther, you have, and if you think about Julian Barnes's wonderful novel, History of the World in 10.5 chapters, the story of Noah's Ark told through the woodworm that nestles in the ship. So I was wondering how one could actually think with the giraffe here as well, which will certainly have to be a creative enterprise because our giraffes leave no records except of their shit in copious quantities, as you have rightly pointed out in your piece, Ari. So over now to Sumangala, and then we can probably come back and think about what we can do with this, because this is really fascinating. This has been enthralling, actually, listening to these presentations and how they kind of fit into each other so beautifully and raise a huge set of themes. I mean, I'm even thinking of a volume that could come out of this with illustrations and, and of course, Sumangala and Ari can take it in different directions towards opera and high drama and something that will run like Hamilton for years and years. And so anyway, so Sumangala, over to you.
Yeah. Well, what I have to say is, is going to stand out in this panel really, because what I thought I'll do is to actually just share with you what I'm thinking, can go into a musical production. And this is just the beginning, because we really have been waiting for this session. We've been waiting for this session to, try and figure out, do we have a story? Is it, what is the narrative going to be like? Do we have songs coming up? Do we have poems? Do we, and so on. And I'm sure, as the production is being planned, there's also a very significant visual element which is being planned. And so I out of this today's discussion, I'm sure lots of very interesting visual ideas are going to come up as well. So so what I'm just going to share with you is that given that we have no evidence, practically no evidence of music, or if we do, as a lot of sort of medievalist musicologists in Europe are constantly wondering, how do we know that it actually, even if you actually find scores, how do you know that it was played in a particular way? So without getting into those questions of, what might have been authentic music that was being played or performed at that time in all these different locations, how do we actually look at contemporary music? The different kinds of traditions that we encounter, or the AfroAsia project has encountered over these several years. How do we look at contemporary forms of music and trace old history? So in other words, if we want to imagine what was happening, when the giraffes were transported, say in the 15th century, how can we try and imagine that world musically? So so what I've tried to do over the past couple of months is to one, get in touch with people, of course, who we would work with, but even before starting work properly on an opera or on a musical production of some sort, what were the musical traditions that existed, and what does historical information tell us? And by the way, historical information actually does not tell us a lot, in the sense that existing research that there is abysmally scarce when it comes to looking at musical connections. So what is acknowledged far more, for example, Tansen's own work on the giraffe, very, very rich material, which actually goes beyond small geographical stretches, whereas the work in music is limited to smaller geographical stretches. So you might have a lot of work on the Andalusian world, for example, which is from Southern Europe to North Africa. There is a lot of work on the Persian and the Turkish, the Turco-Persian influences on Indian music, for example, but the connections are not looked at. So what we've been trying to do as part of this AfroAsia project is to actually, look through various traces that we are identifying, how these connections could be told in a different way, or how these stories can be narrated in a different way using music as a lens. So what I thought I'll do today is to just share with you some of those ideas that hopefully will go into the musical production. So if I start where Ari's script begins, which is Malindi, and the giraffe and its journey, in the words of its keepers, so who might they have been? Who would these keepers have been? And so as Tansen has suggested and is also researching for elephants, this ecosystem of people around the transport of animals, who would they have been? So if we actually are focusing on a very important dimension of Afro-Asian trade from the pre-colonial period onwards, it is that sailors and other crew and perhaps veterinarians and other experts, handlers and wranglers and so on, perhaps were also multinational. Manuscripts from different parts of the Afro-Asian imaginary do suggest that the different points that we are looking at in the Afro-Asian map, in the pre-colonial Afro-Asian map, is actually inhabited by people from different parts of the Indian Ocean world or from the Silk Route world. And so we could expect therefore that maybe in Malindi you had primarily Swahili speaking people, but maybe a smattering of Arabic, Malayalam, Bengali, Farsi, Balochi speaking people in various combinations. And similarly, if we are talking about China, or if we are talking about Bengal, if we are talking about Malabar, or the western coast of India, there is evidence that all these places which were the ports were multi-ethnic or multinational in terms of ethnicity. So then, the question of what language would they have been communicating in, perhaps would have been several languages. Now, I want to, so if there were, people who could have been speaking any of these languages, research tells us that songs with rhythm, boat loading and unloading songs, or ship loading and unloading songs, and songs like the Omani Pearl Divers songs, which Ari has referred to, he's referred to the Pearl Divers in the script, but there is a whole collection of songs which are known as the Pearl Divers songs. Perhaps these were the songs that were being sung. Perhaps these were the songs that were being danced to, sung with variations coming from different ports and their hinterlands. So I just want to give you one example, which is mentioned in the manuscript that Ari and I have just almost completed, which is telling the larger story of the project. And I'll just quote from there. And Sabir Badal Khan, one of the respected ethnomusicologists of the South Asian and the West Asian region, notes that while about 30% of the population of 1 million in the Baluchistan region, which is part of Pakistan and Iran today, are descendants of slaves from Africa, they neither call themselves Afro-Baloch nor claim African descent, having been completely absorbed into ethnic Balochi identity. Now, why am I bringing in the Balochis here? We are not, in the travels of the giraffe, we are not really talking about the Balochis, but then perhaps they might have been there among the handlers or among the crew. Now, other groups of people called the Shidis and the Gulams, and we have the Siddi community of African origin in various parts of India as well. You have the Shidis and the Gulams. Now, the Gulam is a word for servant, or it could also be a term for slave. Two communities of African descent. They belong to the third and lowest stratum in a three-tiered classification of Balochi society, often distinguished by physical traits. Now, Sabir Badal Khan, in his ethnomusicological work, has actually talked about particular musical forms that can be found in the Balochistan region, which according to him have African origin. And so musical traditions bear the distinct influence of African past or interactions between populations, particularly through the Dao experiences, both at sea and in the ports. Now, two music dance forms, which are called the Amba and the Leva, identified by their drumming patterns, appear, according to Badal Khan's research, to have distinct African roots. Now, the Amba is a work song, which is found in the Baluchistan region. Very recently, I discovered that there is a form called Amba, which is a ship loading and unloading song form, which is there in Malabar, which is there not only in Malabar, along the Kerala and the Tamil Nadu coastlines. Now, this is something that no researchers or no ethnomusicologist has picked up until now. Now, so there is this form called the Amba, and the Amba is supposed to have come from the Swahili. The word Amba is supposed to have come from the Swahili term Wimbo, which means song in general. I mean, I don't know whether I'm right, but this is according to Badal Khan. So so in other words, what I'm trying to point out is that one musical form called the Amba, which is a work song, is something that is found, certainly must have, some version of it must be there in East Africa. It's found all along the Makran coast, which is, coastal Baluchistan. It is found along the western coast, the southwestern coast of India, and it is a live musical tradition today, song tradition today. It's also there in the Lakshadweep Islands in the Indian Ocean. So, so this is just one example, and the Amba as a musical form is something that I think we are going to use, because it's also associated with rhythm and drumming, and perhaps also dancing is something that we will definitely use as part of the production. So this is just one example that I wanted to give you, which is an example of music which obviously came from the working class, or those who were not part of the elites. Now, when we are talking about the giraffe's journey, there would have been musical traditions, and we are talking about the 15th century when in India, for example, what came to be known as the Hindustani tradition later on had already assimilated what was an older Indian tradition of classical music with what came from the Turco-Persian traditions, which traveled, from the Persian and the Arabic world. And and from the 13th century, I mean, the 13th century, in fact, is supposed to be the period in which this assimilation is supposed to have taken place. So what is a vibrant classical tradition, which seemed to have come into shape in its, or what has been carried down in some form or the other to this day, got shaped in the 13th century, and Bengal certainly would have had a significant influence of that, emerging Hindustani tradition in the 15th century. So, so let me then move to Bengal. What would have been the music in Bengal at the time when the giraffe would have been getting transported? I think the musical world would have consisted of three kinds of music in Bengal. First, as I said, the Hindustani tradition itself, which probably would have been some kind of a classical tradition, because it was quite canonized by the 13th century, and in the 15th century, it was certainly, very much part of the canonical classical Hindustani tradition. The second, which is interesting, and I think is something that we will definitely bring into the production musically, is what came from what is considered the syncretic music, which had both Hindu as well as Islamic influences. So communities of people who came to be known as the fakirs, mendicants, the mendicants or the mystics, known both as the fakirs and as the bauls. The baul tradition, which in Bengal is a very, very powerful and very diverse musical tradition. So the fakiri tradition, the baul tradition, something called the Bengali Qawwali. Now the Qawwali as a form is supposed to have inherited features which came from Persia and Baghdad and so on the one hand. A certain version of that is supposed to have also traveled towards North Africa, and again, a modal form of music which is known as the howl, which is still practiced extensively across different parts of North Africa. It became the Qawwali in North Indian music. Now there is a very specific kind of a musical form called the Bengali Qawwali, which integrated the Qawwali, which might have come from the Persian side, with more indigenous Bengali, musical touches. Now, again, there are people who, the Bengali Qawwali is not something that is either written about very much, or not too much material is available online about it. But perhaps, I mean, there's very, very little research that actually talks about the Bengali Qawwali. But there are some recordings which are available. But the Bengali Qawwali might have been a form which actually came into existence around that time. So between, and there's also, devotional Hindu Vaishnavite tradition, which existed in Bengal. So so the Bengali musical world at that point is likely to have had all these different kinds of influences. Now, I won't, so at the moment, a major absence for us musically is the Chinese side, in terms of, we really don't know what Chinese music might have sounded at that point. Fortunately, we have been in touch with two Chinese musicians, Ying Li from the Minzu University in China, and Daiguo Li, an independent musician. They're both professional musicians trained in Chinese classical music. Ying Li is an eru player, and Daiguo Li plays the pipa and several other instruments. The pipa is the whatever Chinese incarnation of the oud, which is supposed to have traveled perhaps from Baghdad. Now, Daiguo Li, very interestingly, is also trained in Carnatic music and has worked with Indian musicians before. So we've started a conversation with both of them, and hopefully, therefore, the big absence that we have in terms of, knowledge about what might have been, Chinese musical traditions around the 15th century, hopefully that will get bridged. So we also have, Siti Amina, a Zanzibari singer, composer, and an oud player joining us this time for the production. And apart from that, of course, we have two musicians from India, three musicians from India. In fact, Mark Arana, who's a guitar player, but who has started playing the dotara. Now, the dotara is a very important instrument in the Baul tradition. We have Pritam Ghoshal, who plays the sarod, and Ahsan Ali, who plays the sarangi. And then we have, Sazid Lamini, who plays several instruments. So we are hoping that with this kind of collection of fantastic musicians, we will be able to pull it off in terms of imagining what the musical world of the 15th century might have been, and pulling off a production. Thank you. I'll stop with that.
Thanks, Sumangala. And again, there was a wonderful connection between the papers of Tansen, the presentation by Ari Tabo and Purav, and your presentation, because it raises this question of this polyphonic, polyglot world of the ocean, that people are speaking to each other in multiple languages, that people on board ship are making music, and this music comes to us from different realms. And I was just wondering whether it's important to, when you speak about the music in Bengal, to think with questions of Hindu, Muslim, and so on. So instead of a word like syncretic, we could think about a word like eclectic. So the music comes from everywhere and without these divisions. But I think this question of, to bring it back to the giraffe, if he asked the question, who speaks for the giraffe? How does the giraffe speak? This question of what did the giraffe hear is also an important question, I think, and particularly here. And one of the things is that the register of the giraffe, we know that giraffes constantly hum to each other, right? I mean, this is what most zookeepers say, that they hum to each other at frequencies of 92 kilohertz, so we can't really hear it. So what would it mean to bring the original hum back into your music, to bring the giraffe's voice into the music, apart from all our voices and our instruments and our languages? What do we do with the hum of the giraffe? Might be an interesting question to think with when we do this music as well. But thank you, this has been extraordinary. I'm so excited by this. So maybe we could just ask each other questions right now. and all of you are visible to me, so just raise a hand and it will be, I can see it. So please, let's riff. Yes, Tabo. Please remember. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by all this information that I'm suddenly, discovering. I didn't know giraffes are mute, for instance. So, the thought of coming up with a way to communicate on behalf of the giraffe. How will one do that? How do we communicate? So it just kind of, it just left me with a question mark there. I thought that was very interesting. Not being a scholar in the giraffe or even the migration of the giraffe and all these, you've just opened up a whole new world to me. But I had just maybe two other comments, if not, I think, well, Ari mentioned that, this was a comical attempt, and maybe it's just the way we read it, because I feel that it can be very emotional, it can be very emotive, it can have interesting dynamics and tension, as you were saying, Dilip, of the violence in the human and the relationship between the human and, and the animal. So that's just, I think, maybe a comment there. And also with what Sumangala was talking about, when you mentioned the Bengali Qawwali, it just brought to mind the Zanzibari Tarab, and then made me wonder if there is an equivalent in Tanzania or something similar. That is not necessarily Zanzibari Tarab, but very much can be identifiable as Tanzanian form of music. That's all the comment or question. There wasn't a question really, but comment. Thanks.
Thanks. Astrid?
Sorry, got a comment that links to the voice, and it's about perspective. I'm just imagining if I'm a giraffe on a boat, and my head always has to be, or my neck has to be supported, my head has always got to be up there. My perspective of the boat, of people, of life is looking down. And I think it's a really interesting one, because usually we think of top down as like top is the power and down as the masses and powerless. And so this strange inversion of the powerless looking down on the others. And I was just putting it together with, what Alvin said about the feminine and, the giraffe being the feminine. And of course, the exploitation of women, very similar to that of animals. So this extraordinary inversion, if I'm thinking giraffe, also women, let me leave it there. So I guess I come to it from an ecofeminist perspective. And I find that really, really interesting. What if we were to, look down from the top? So that's like her voice in a way is about in her perspective. And then what she hears were bits and pieces. And then a question to Sumi, I guess, is, Sumi, do you know, are there any kind of songs, not necessarily that, you sing to animals, but songs, hums of whatever, the equivalent of saying to make a horse move? Is there something specific about other animals? And conversely, are there lullabies? What might a lullaby to a giraffe sound like if they're trying to soothe it? And maybe it has something to do with that hum that Dilip mentioned, and maybe it has something to do with the perspective, because it kind of travels all the way up and is heard in bits and pieces. There was a third one, but I can't remember it now. So let me stop here.
Suni, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I don't really have any answers, in the sense that one of the ideas that I have been playing with in my mind, and I know that, once we get working, for example, so there is so much of Indian music or Indian theater forms, for example, which are performing animals, right? So you have, whether it's Hanuman or whether the animal characters, which can traverse time, myth, history, whatever it is. So those can be invoked very easily. It's not something that, it's not necessarily humans reporting what animals are doing, but animals speaking in their voice, animals and birds, for example. So, and I'm sure there are lots of these kinds of equivalents in Africa, where does the whole thing of instruments creating animal sounds come from, or sort of instruments playing like we hear sounds in nature. That must be coming surely from the voice in some sense of the animal. So that's something that that's something that we could be working with. And just a word about Tarab. From what I know, the Zanzibari Tarab is an 18th century creation. Much later. But I'm sure the Tarab had, when it developed as a formal codified system of music much later, but it must have been drawing upon influences. Whatever I've heard of the Tarab, for example, sounds very familiar. Sounds familiar to my ears, so obviously the resonances across all these parts of the, the Indian Ocean world or the Silk Route world are very obvious in terms of contemporary music forms or, later music forms as well. So Tarab doesn't really belong to the period that we are talking about. Yeah.
Actually, Astrid, you raised a very interesting question. I'm still wondering how to think through that. That the question of looking down from above being the vantage point of suffering. And that's an extraordinary point to think with, because the giraffe realizes nothing through its imposing presence. And this is something that goes back to what Alvin said at the very beginning, that if he went through the books in the library and you either had this human guilt about the fear of the extinction of the giraffe, or you had children's books. And if you actually, when I searched the net, I could find very few poems that dealt with the giraffe, which were not children's poems or limericks and so on. The giraffe doesn't seem to be the object of grandeur enough for poetry, right? There's something about the appearance of the giraffe that moves us towards the risible, the light-hearted, the child, rather than the kind of profundity that a cat, a tiger, an elephant produces in us. And this is again something that speaks to what you raised. Why is the giraffe not grand enough despite being a grand animal? Right? Why is it that it doesn't invoke these feelings? The other question really was that of suffering, because that's something that we haven't really spoken about very much. We know that the giraffe may have suffered. Ari brought it up a bit, that there's this kind of fear and trembling that the giraffe is in. It's excreting a lot. It's kind of troubled in this. So, because when you think about the First World War and human casualties and animal casualties, the scale is extraordinarily different, right? You might think 1 million human beings may have died, perhaps even less in the First World War, but 8 million animals die, right? In the process of transportation, on scenes of conflict, and so on. And so there's a scale of suffering that somehow we need to think about when we think about this giraffe who doesn't invoke a kind of grand sympathy in us. Right? So, Astrid, did you want to say something, and then we'll move to Yvonne? Your mic was on mute.
Yeah, I know. And I was just thinking it doesn't invoke pity even.
Yes.
So in some ways, maybe we need to invoke outrage.
Yes. No, what is the appropriate register of emotion here? Right? Yvonne?
Yeah, I've quite a few things coming up. First of all, is that I think it depends on where the context and the culture of perspective. Back to what the giraffe sees. There was the former vice president in Kenya was the late Oginga was. No, when he referred to Moi, whom a lot of people regarded as a kind of wretched dictator, he said he was a giraffe, in that this is a giraffe. His view of the world is further than anybody else's. So there are incredible aphorisms and sayings embedded in the cultures that are not necessarily visible or in the mainstream places. I was thinking, I recently did a National Geographic assignment and ended up in the heart of not the Masai Mara, but the loiters that not many people know about. If you can imagine alpine savanna, where owned and managed by the indigenous communities there, and had the privilege of getting immersed in an incredible worldview and ethos of interspecies relationships, relatedness, that it's the kind of no big deal. You're walking to town and then there's a giraffe walking next to you, but there's no big deal about that. And I was struck by a couple of things. There are 13 different Maasai words for the giraffe. I wasn't aware, if I'd been aware, I'd have asked, what does each particularly mean? The Maasai poetics called Eoko, E-O-K-O, is replete with incredible, it's also one of the ways of passing down both chronicle stories, but also guiding those, because of course, pastoralist, nomadic, pastoralist, and pastoralist nomads, meaning you're going to traverse landscapes. Some of the ways of holding on to the memory of relationship with whichever creature you're going to meet is passed down in the Eoko, like I said, E-O-K-O. The poetics are there, but they haven't been necessarily written or spelled out. What else did I want to say? You spoke after Sumangala's presentation, you spoke of polyphonic. I had written down polyphonic. The part of Maasai Eoko is polyphony. You've heard it, and it is hum, and it's hum, 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 and it's hum with various different registers and pitches, just in terms of what is the language of the giraffe. There is, and within, again, one of the conversations we had when I was there in the loiters, when I was asking, how did, for the rest of the world, it feels very strange that you can coexist. You can, your children are playing out in the garden and the zebra, the impala, the, stories of the nomadic lions are passing by. And again, it's no big deal. So I'd asked about what are the guiding principles? And they spoke about something called ilmanyara, a kind of ethos of hospitality and openness to that which exists, and it presumes also that animals have agency. Because I was, there's this whole conversation about human-wildlife conflict, and it was fascinating here being told that the raiding, the cheetah or the leopard or the hyena that raids a person's enkang, a homestead, knows what it is doing. It also has a moral agency, and it was a fascinating notion. But the idea that animals, there is, in that realm of hospitality, in which you do not expect the other being to change, there's a communication. There may be a space in which, for example, the Maasai, for whom these are major archetypes, what is their language? What is their language of communication and exchange with the giraffe? How do they know what the giraffe is saying? And is there a space in which we can enter to discover that? Just a little reference about the CD. I didn't know much about the Gulam, but about the CD, because we hosted them when I was in Zanzibar. I know one of the things they had been saying is that they keep being written out their lives keep being written as if they only went to India as slaves. they themselves, among themselves, in their conversation, say they left as teachers, as traders. Some may have been enslaved, but they had a longer history. Their own telling of who they are is far more complex. They left as a ship, as handlers, and as as workers on ships and ship captains, as part of a long history of exchange, and settled in those parts of India in the same way that Gujarat, Balochi, and other traders also settled in parts of East Africa. So I think to be aware of the kind of, the cultural agency and ages that in which we're going to speak.
This is a very important, I think the way in which Yvonne spoke to Astrid there, this question of the, one of the words that Astrid used was outrage. Right? Mm-hmm. And Yvonne, you're raising this question of animal feelings as well. Did the giraffe feel outrage? What did the giraffe feel on the boat? Right? Mm-hmm. We don't know. But this question of outrage becomes crucial when you talk to us about the Maasai and the idea that animals have agency, that when they do things, they're doing, like the leopard attacking a settlement, has a sense of what it is doing. Is it motivated by rage? Is it motivated by hunger? Is it motivated by, and so on and so forth.
It knows wrong and right, because and right, yes. It knows, yeah.
And I think, this takes us back to ways of thinking in Asian, in African, one could call it pre-modern, one could call it traditional, one could call it a mode of being in which humans and animals are more in contact and more in harmony with each other. Mm-hmm. Think about the Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, one of the beginnings is in the burning of the Khandav forest. The forest is being burned in order to clear space for the building of a city, the setting up of a palace, kings, and so on. But the story of the burning of the Khandav forest is told through a bird trapped in the fire. Right? And the bird is speaking to the question of protecting its children. And it's concerned about its progeny, it's concerned about the next generation. And the bird is anguished about the fire. And one of the children says, look, I'll go into the snake hole and take protection there. And the mother says, look, there might be a snake there, which might eat you up. So amidst this conflagration that human beings have created, there is this tragedy, or there is this evocation of a tragedy that the human beings are not conscious of. And I think this kind of trying to find a way of thinking about the giraffe, which brings in these earlier relationships, this earlier conception of relationships, the idea of the agency of the animal, right, which you pointed to, that might be extraordinary, and also address what we are trying so hard to do in this age that we are calling Anthropocene, but which has become really a narcissistic phrase, where we put the human, back again in the, just as, we are the ones who created all this devastation, and now we need to atone. And still there isn't a cognition of this shared world that we live in. So, it's a very important question here.
I was just going to say, add to that, the place where I went, the loiter, and if you look it up, fortunately, I'm saying there's not enough, it doesn't have too much of a projection in the world, even though it is over 300 kilometers, in radius, and it's mountain, hills, and it's incredible sight. And what is unique about it is that the loiter Maasai have managed to retain custodianship, and have done so for kind of like centuries. So somehow they manage to keep people away. So these values that we're talking about are still very present there. As it's literally as if you drive up the hill, you hit the valley, and you've entered a whole other world. So I'd be curious because those values you talk about, the idea of worlds within worlds are right there. And again, and I think just pointing to what Astrid said, and I know as much as the giraffe is not prominent in books of the modern world, its prominence and value is completely embedded in these particular landscapes and spaces in which it is an incredible archetype of profound meaning. So I guess what I'm saying is that some of our sources may need to be not in the libraries. Yes.
Alvin and then Ari.
Yeah. So I was going to say, first of all, I must apologize. I might have to bow out earlier than usual to sort out my domestic lock situation. There's a dispute with the locksmith. But I want to say two things. One is to really second Yvonne's profound perspective of a very different epistemology, a different way of looking at and looking from, rather, thinking about the perspective of the animal world, the giraffe, having its own moral agency and so on. And I think one of the ways in which we encode human supremacy over the animal world is to collapse and condense and homogenize animal agency. When we talk about the voice of the giraffe, it's and you know, I was trying to gesture at this in my piece as well. It's as if we expect one giraffe to speak for all giraffes, right? You see where I'm coming from. It's very much like those of us in the diaspora expected to speak for an entire tribe of how many millions of billions of people, as if we can somehow encode the Chinese mind or the African mind, you know, in one voice. In a similar way, can we really encode the giraffe mind in any one voice? Particularly when giraffes are themselves, especially today and certainly back then, they come from very different places. They're different species and subspecies. They're different individuals. You know, a giraffe born and bred in Singapore is very different from a giraffe, you know, born and bred in Israel or on the Serengeti and so on and so forth.
How would we know
the perspectives are completely different. Yeah, how do we, but why do we assume that they aren't, you see? We speak of them as if those experiences let me give you an example. Singapore at one point had a locally born and bred polar bear in the tropics. And it was very comfortable swimming in waters that apparently would be extremely uncomfortable or even kill a polar bear born, you know, in the native cold regions. And there are things it can do and will do and likes to do. Diet, for example, what is comfortable, they are very, very different. So I'm thinking about, is there a way to express or think about the giraffe as having a similar individual agency the way we allow ourselves that, right? And I'm just thinking agency doesn't make sense unless it is individualized and personalized, because then you know, agency only makes sense if you can say one panther might do something that another might not. One giraffe might do something that another might not. The question of particular choices comes into play. The question of decisions might come into play. And you know, I don't have an answer, but it just strikes me as when we talk about the voice of the giraffe, this is a relevant question.
This is a very human notion of agency, you know, because you're asking that. So if you ask how would you define agency? And then there's a question of rationality, there's a question of premeditation, there's a question of foresight. When you talk about the giraffe or when you talk about an animal, perhaps we need another sense which doesn't proceed from the hubris of the human self. So I think it's an important question that you're raising. How do we think about the self of the giraffe? How do we think about the agency of the giraffe? And I don't think we should move in the direction of saying, look, if we can't speak for one giraffe, we can't speak for all giraffes. And by speaking for one giraffe, are we speaking for all giraffes? Because these are, in some sense, merely hubristic exercises. In the end, we shan't really know what the giraffe thinks, feels, and so on and so forth. Right? These are attempts to project. Yeah.
Indeed, but I guess what I'm interested in are questions of situated voices and situated knowledges.
Yeah.
You know, I'm interested in how the voice of one of the giraffes on Zhenhe's ship, maybe the one from Aden, differs from the voices of the giraffe that went to Florence. I want to hear from them their different stories. I think that's fair enough. I'm curious about those questions. It might well be if they were entirely interested in the same things and saw only the same things. But the point is, I'm curious about how those situated experiences shape the stories that they might tell the way they want to tell them. And I really do have to run. I'm sorry about this. And I will catch up on whatever whatever transpires. This is absolutely fascinating, and clearly there is a thread going on. There is a conversation to be had. There are arguments to be made, which is what makes it all interesting. I'm glad we're all not talking about the same things, but there is enough common ground to pitch a tent on and have a bit of a duel on. So thank you for having me on this, and I hope we continue.
Yeah, and don't feel a pang of guilt about leaving. Ari.
Yeah, that's the issue that Yvonne raised about the poetics is very important. It's not, I'm aware in Nguni languages, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the word is Indlulameti, which relates to a tall tree, a home on a tall tree, if I get my translation right. So there is a way through which the poetic traditions carry it both as a metaphor, but also as an alibi, perhaps, for a whole range of human actions. And we have to explore that, all those so-called Zulu traditions of speaking of a very, very local animal as well, the Indlulamiti. And, we only know we learn about the big hero praise poetry, which is always about lion and the aggressive animals, but there will be poetics there, and we have to explore them. The issue of the language of the giraffes is a fascinating one, but we have to go back to the murmur and try and see how the giraffes communicate, and whether, interesting question, is whether giraffes from all kinds of points of the world, when they get back to enforce nature to save them, whether they communicate, or whether there are aberrant forms of behavior, whether like dogs that have one language that understand each other. It's fascinating questions but the murmurs of the giraffe will be one of the easiest things, if Sumangala and her friends permit, to bring into music, because we can increase the volume and make it audible, and bring it into the soundscape in interesting ways. But yeah, so the issues of the epistemology, of the poetics, have to come into it. And I would plead with everybody to chuck lines, in our direction once we start moving towards a stage production. Poems, as you said, Dilip, thick descriptions, anything, because the methodology we're going to be using for the presentation will allow anything, including quotations, to come through. So a plea, please bully us with words, as many as possible.
No physical bullying. Okay, I get it. Tansen, you had something to say? Yes.
Yeah, I want to say two things. One, I think not all animals are same, right? I mean, biologically, giraffe is quite unique. And there have been a number of issues. And when I was looking at transportation, is that giraffes don't like water. They do float, but they avoid rivers. So there must be some kind of a fear that comes to them when they are transported. They don't react as elephants do. And this has to do with the biology of the giraffes as well. It's not only the neck issue, it's also the leg issue. They have long legs and they slip quite easily. And their cardiac function is also very weak. So they might die of heart attacks as well. And so there are, so when we don't know how they speak, but we can try to figure out biological limitations and aspects of giraffes and think about how they may be feeling when they are being transported. So I would suggest looking at ways in which the zookeepers are told how to handle giraffes, given their unique biological features. So I think that may be the way of looking at the giraffes' perspective, right? So the limitations caused by their unique features and biological makeup. The other one is about the music. And here, I think instead of just looking at the music of the people on land, I think we should also look at the music of the people on the seas, the sailors. And they have their own ways, no matter where they are coming from. And I think here Ibn Battuta talks about the Chinese sailors in Chinese junks singing songs, for example. But Amitav Ghosh has also, I think, written about the Lascars and their singing. So I think there is on water music that may be different from the music on the coastal regions and lands. And so I think that is something perhaps, Sumangala, if you are doing this, is to see what kind of music was on the ships. And I think there are some ethnographic, ethnomusical research on circulation of music in the Indian Ocean world as well. I can dig up some of the references, but that may be useful to not constrain ourselves on the land, but also think about the music on the seas. And then here also Bengal, as you mentioned, at this time is Islamic, right? So it's a Bengal Sultanate in the 15th century, and it's dominated by Persian-speaking people, traders and rulers as well. So I think the use of Sufi music may be something also quite important. And the language, certainly in the 15th century, if there's a lingua franca at this point, it starts from the 12th century to the 15th century before the Portuguese come in, seems to be Persian. And so we should perhaps be looking at Persian side of things as well, to see how people may be communicating in different languages, but particularly in Persian.
Actually, Rhoda, I think we've been together for 2 hours now. We could probably start winding up, and perhaps in an email following this, we could think about whether we can carry this particular format of the session for a public, right? Where you do this again in a more finished version for the public, where we have precise 10-minute formations, or that we build upon what we have spoken and write pieces which can then be put up on the website that Ari hosts or elsewhere, or think about a journal issue in which we write, put together all of the multiple possibilities, and which will help to consolidate what we, because I think we've said very interesting and very felt things here today. And I don't want to lose this, right? I've taken extensive notes as we speak, but it might be interesting to actually write all of this down. And I began writing a set of poems, a set of 5 poems, and then I gave up because I wasn't able to get the right register. But if you will indulge me, I just want to read something that I began with, right? I mean, it's not particularly good, but I just want to read it out to you. Mute and swaying, the ground beneath my feet moves, a bucking I had not known. The grasslands were still, only the skies rocked with anger, sheets of lightning ripped the sky. I heard that crack again as my hoof went through the floor. So that's the only thing I wrote, but I want to write a series of 5, which actually speaks to the giraffe. So anyway, but thank you so much. I mean, you've had such an extraordinary range. Is there anything that anyone else wants to say? But I do think we should carry this forward. Ruda?
I just wanted to remind you that I had created that there's a Google Drive for people to share materials. So if anybody wants to put in their presentations or notes or whatever, there is a space where we can do this more easily accessible than emails, which maybe can't always be kept track of. Yeah, I'm happy to share the link again if necessary. So just let me know.
No, yeah, Ari, please.
I think it's not an either or, all the above. It's let's continue, and it could be a journal, it could be a book, it could be a
presentation like
festival. Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to stay with this so that this group actually continues to think, because we are creatures. I mean, at least I'm a creature of words and not of music, not of performance. And I suspect Tansen is also somebody who prefers the archive and the word and then so on and so forth. So I think we've got different kinds of engagements with the giraffe. But so to have a format like this where we do something for the public, conversations on the giraffe, which take up a whole set of issues, might be a good thing, probably a month from now, which gives us time to write, maybe slightly later. But anyway, that's worth thinking about. But thank you all. Thank you, Ari, Sumangala, Tansen, Astrid, Yvonne, Purav, Tabu, Ruda.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this.
And the absent Alvin. May his door never be locked. Okay, ciao, guys.
Maybe not never.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello. You unmute. You're muted. You are muted.
I've got a packet with some stuff for you, some shirts.
Yay! I'm due to see Ari this afternoon. So will you be home?
Oh, yeah, no, it's in the bedroom. He knows which bag it is. I don't know if there's anything of use, but you can have a look.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
See you later. Bye.